High in the Himalayas lies Tibet, a land often called the roof of the world. For centuries it remained isolated, ruled by monks and nobles, shielded by mountains and tradition. But in 1950, this remote plateau became the target of one of the most decisive military campaigns in modern Chinese history. The newly founded People's Republic of China was determined to bring Tibet under its control, and it would do so with overwhelming force. What followed was a clash between an ancient kingdom with a tiny, poorly armed army and the massive, battle-hardened forces of Mao's Red Army. In less than a month, Tibet's defenses crumbled. Yet the consequences of that swift invasion would echo far beyond the battlefield, shaping geopolitics, sparking uprisings, and igniting a controversy that still burns today. This is the story of the invasion of Tibet in 1950, how China conquered the roof of the world. To understand why China invaded Tibet in 1950, we need to look at the political map of Asia in the aftermath of World War II. For centuries, Tibet had lived in relative isolation. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the region was effectively self-governing under the authority of the Dalai Lama. Its government maintained only limited contact with the outside world, mostly with neighboring India and Britain, while Beijing, whether under the nationalists or later the communists, continued to claim Tibet as part of China's territory. By 1949, the Chinese Civil War was over. Mao Zedong had proclaimed the People's Republic of China, and his new government set out to reunify the motherland. Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Tibet were all seen as vital frontiers that had to be secured. For Mao, Tibet was not only a question of sovereignty, it was also about strategy. The Tibetan Plateau formed a massive buffer zone against India in the west, sitting at the crossroads of the Himalayas and Central Asia. Inside Tibet itself, things were fragile. The government in Lhasa had only a small army, perhaps 10,000 soldiers at most, poorly armed and poorly trained. The region had no modern infrastructure, no real allies, and no foreign power willing to recognize it as an independent state. This combination made Tibet a tempting target. To Beijing, it was a loose end left over from the collapse of the old empire, and now was the time to bring it firmly under control. The stage was set for a campaign that would forever change the fate of Tibet. In October 1950, the People's Liberation Army made its move. The operation was known as the Chamdo Campaign, named after the Tibetan frontier town that guarded the eastern approaches to Lhasa. Commanding nearly 40,000 soldiers, the PLA advanced from Sichuan into the rugged mountain terrain. They were veterans of the long civil war against the nationalists, disciplined, organized, and equipped with modern artillery. Facing them were perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 Tibetan troops, brave but scattered, poorly armed, and with little experience in modern warfare. On October 6th, PLA units crossed the upper reaches of the Yangtze River and struck deep into Tibetan defenses. Their strategy was swift and decisive: bypass strongholds, cut communications, and encircle Chamdo before reinforcements could arrive. The Tibetan forces, caught off guard and heavily outnumbered, attempted to resist but were quickly overwhelmed. By October 19th, Chamdo had fallen. The Tibetan governor surrendered, and thousands of Tibetan soldiers were taken prisoner. In just 2 weeks, the backbone of Tibet's frontier defense had collapsed. The path to Lhasa lay open, but here the PLA paused. Rather than march immediately on the capital, Beijing used the victory as leverage, sending a clear message to the Tibetan leadership: negotiate or face total destruction. The fall of Chamdo left the Tibetan government in shock. With its army shattered and its eastern frontier wide open, Lhasa had little choice but to seek negotiations. For the young 14th Dalai Lama, barely 15 years old, the crisis was overwhelming. Should Tibet continue to resist and risk total destruction, or should it try to preserve some autonomy by dealing with the Beijing? In May 1951, under intense pressure, a Tibetan delegation was summoned to Beijing. There they were presented with a document already prepared by the Chinese, the 17-point agreement. It declared that Tibet was part of the People's Republic of China, but promised that the region's political system, religion, and the authority of the Dalai Lama would remain untouched. On paper, it sounded like a compromise. In reality, the Tibetan delegation had little room to maneuver. Outnumbered militarily, isolated diplomatically, and without foreign support, they were forced to sign. The agreement gave China legal cover to station troops in Tibet and extend direct control over the region. When the People's Liberation Army marched into Lhasa later that year, they were not invaders in the eyes of Beijing, but liberators carrying out the will of the central government. For many Tibetans, however, this marked the beginning of the end of their independence. For nearly a decade after the 17-point agreement, Tibet lived under uneasy tension. Beijing had promised autonomy and religious freedom, but in practice, the People's Liberation Army tightened its grip. More Chinese officials arrived in Lhasa, land reforms were quietly introduced, and monasteries began to feel the weight of communist oversight. Among Tibetans, resentment grew. The presence of foreign troops in their holy city, restrictions on traditional practices, and the fear of losing their cultural identity created a climate of deep mistrust. In the countryside, guerrilla resistance began to stir, sometimes aided in secret by foreign powers, including covert support from the CIA. By 1959, the situation reached breaking point. Rumors spread that the Chinese planned to abduct the Dalai Lama and remove him from his position. Thousands of Tibetans surrounded his palace in Lhasa, determined to protect their spiritual leader. Within days, this turned into open revolt. On March 10th, the Lhasa Uprising erupted. Tens of thousands of Tibetans clashed with PLA troops. Armed mostly with old rifles and traditional weapons, the rebels stood little chance against artillery and modern firepower. The fighting was brutal. Monasteries and neighborhoods were shelled, and thousands of Tibetans were killed. Amid the chaos, the Dalai Lama disguised himself and fled across the Himalayas, eventually reaching safety in India. There he established a government in exile that still operates to this day. For Beijing, the 1959 uprising was crushed with overwhelming force. For Tibetans, it was a national tragedy, the last desperate stand for independence, drowned in blood. After the uprising of 1959, Tibet was firmly under Chinese control. The promise of autonomy in the 17-point agreement was effectively abandoned. Beijing tightened its authority, and the Dalai Lama's escape meant that Tibet lost its most important symbol of unity and independence. In the decades that followed, life in Tibet was transformed. From Beijing's perspective, this was a story of progress. The abolition of serfdom, the introduction of modern schools, hospitals, roads, and later even a railway linking Lhasa to the Chinese heartland. Average life expectancy doubled, literacy rose, and material poverty declined. But for many Tibetans, the cost was heavy. Monasteries, once the center of learning and culture, were closed or destroyed, especially during the Cultural Revolution. Religious practices were placed under strict supervision. Han Chinese migration into the region changed the demographics of cities like Lhasa, leading Tibetans to feel increasingly like strangers in their own homeland. Periodic unrest erupted again in 1987, 1989, and most dramatically in 2008, each time met with harsh crackdowns by Chinese security forces. Internationally, Tibet became a powerful symbol of resistance and cultural survival. Yet within the region itself, the political grip of Beijing remained unshakable. For Tibetans, the memory of 1950 and 1959 still lingers. What was lost was not only political independence, but also the sense of living in a land untouched by outside powers. What was gained, roads, schools, modern hospitals, could never fully replace that. The invasion of 1950 and the uprising of 1959 were more than just episodes in China's history. They reshaped the destiny of an ancient land. For Beijing, Tibet became proof of the People's Republic's ability to secure its borders and reclaim lost territories. For Tibetans, it was the loss of sovereignty, a struggle that continues in exile and in memory. Internationally, Tibet remains a symbol of cultural survival and spiritual resistance. The Dalai Lama's voice still resonates across the world, even as the plateau itself remains firmly within China's grasp. The story of Tibet is a reminder that in the modern age, military force can redraw borders in weeks, but it cannot erase identity or silence history. 70 years later, the echoes of 1950 are still with us. The high Himalayas stand as a frontier not only of geography, but of politics, culture, and faith. Tibet's fate reminds us that conquest may be swift, but the struggle over hearts, minds, and freedom can last for generations.